Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, April 30th, 2020, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2020 gubernatorial predictions that I'm going to be making. So I've decided to do this video because tomorrow, and I guess for the next couple of days, starting in the beginning of May, I will be doing this at the beginning of every month. I will go through the Senate races, the House races, and the presidential election map that I update pretty much once a month. But once we start to hit July and August, and then up to the general election, it's going to be a lot more frequent than just 1 month for a presidential electoral map update. Same thing goes for the United States Senate and House Representatives, but the governor map, I'm pretty confident that we should just take about once a month to talk about it. If anything substantial happens in individual states, I will go over it in depth. I may go into each one of these states, or at least each one of these swing states in depth, but for right now, I'm going to go ahead and just make a very general video discussing all of the races. Considering there's only 11, 2022 is definitely the next time that we could talk about important governor elections because there will be a lot more than 11 up. I think there were 34 in 2018, if that included special elections or not, 35 or something like that. There's some elections in 2019 where there were some elections in 2019, I think 3 of them, and then I guess the rest are in other years. 2017 is New Jersey and Virginia, and then 11 here. So pretty much there's not too much to worry about for either political party. Although this does end up deciding who will be the governor during the redistricting, it's a census year, it's not going to be, I guess there's not going to be too much money thrown into this race. A lot of people really aren't going to care because a lot of these races are pretty much already decided, realistically. I mean, there are only a number of notable races, and that's pretty much only 5 races that I don't consider safe, or at least very likely to go for a certain political party. So the first state that I do want to talk about is the state of West Virginia. This one has a really interesting dynamic because this state previously was ran, I guess, by a Democrat in 2016, Jim Justice. He announced in 2017 that he would be switching political parties, effectively giving Republicans one more in the governor's map. I think the Democratic number went from 17 down to 16, but they were already at a really bad standing, so this didn't necessarily hurt them too bad. But Jim Justice was a Democrat before, switched over to the Republican Party, and now it looks like he's on track to win the nomination. If he does end up winning the nomination, it's pretty much almost certain that he wins this race. I consider this one safe, considering that the incumbent most likely will win renomination. The only way that I could see this getting competitive is if there's a huge party split or fracture in the Republican Party in West Virginia, and realistically, it's not going to happen. Going over to the state of Indiana, there isn't much to look at here. The state of Indiana never really was close. The last time, 2016, it was supposed to be a Democratic victory. In fact, a lot of the data suggested that the Democrat was going to win. This is coming after Vice President Mike Pence's, I guess he won in 2012, but he won against the guy who ran in 2016. Mike Pence was an unpopular governor. Keep that in mind. But Eric Holcomb ended up taking it away, and that's likely because Donald Trump won the state by, double digits. And Eric Holcomb considerably underperformed President Trump here, but he's on a pathway to easily win re-election. No real discussion about that one. So that's another safe Republican seat. That puts the Republicans at 21. Keep in mind, 26 is needed for a majority, but there is no real majority. I guess there's no governing body that decides all at once how each state would go. Obviously, governors are up to decide whatever's best for their own states, and this majority is pretty much fictional. Realistically, it's just a chairman's position. There isn't too much power behind it. But 21 Republican seats, 20 Democratic seats. Let's move on to the next, I guess you could say, safe state, the state of North Dakota. This one doesn't really need too much. North Dakota is a solid Republican state. The last time it was competitive for a Democrat, I think, was possibly 2018 with that Senate race, but it was a pretty substantial loss for Heidi Heitkamp in 2018. But North Dakota, realistically, is not going to be close. In 2008, they actually had a Democratic representative, which I thought was insanely interesting. But since then, there hasn't been too much hope for Democrats in the state of North Dakota, especially since it's a pretty solid Republican state on presidential elections and a number of other statewide races as well. The state of Utah, they have a retiring governor, but don't make any mistake, that state is 100% going to go to the GOP. There's no real chance. Looking at the Republican nominees, even if there is some type of party fracture, a lot of them are going to end up getting behind the Republican nominee anyway, and considering there's no incumbent, there may not be a clear front runner, so there won't be as much of an issue with a contested primary. The only time I could ever see a contested primary is if there's an incumbent and somehow that incumbent is unseated, and that causes turmoil within the political party. So that puts the Republicans at 23, the Democrats at 20. Let's talk about some safe Democratic seats. So we have Washington. Jay Inslee is the first governor to run for re-election since 1972, not run for a third term in terms of when I mean re-election. He ran for president in 2020. If you remember, he did not do too well. He did push for a lot of environmental policies. That was pretty much his only political issue that he really harped on that entire campaign season. Obviously didn't make it far, did not get any delegates, but had a pretty notable national name for just a tad bit of time, just because of the fact that he did announce his race and his bid for the presidency. But Washington is almost certainly going to be a Democratic state. And same thing goes for Delaware. Again, this is actually Joe Biden's home state, or not necessarily home state. Pennsylvania is his home state, where he served as a senator from. Delaware is 100% going to the Democrats. So the rest of these 5 races are really what's going to determine which political party comes out on top here. And the Republicans currently have, I believe, a 26 to 24 seat majority in the National Governors Association. That comes after the Democrats picking up 1 seat in the state of Kentucky in 2019. After 2018, it was 27-23, and then it narrowed down. But we shouldn't see too much changing in terms of the overall party composition right now. Missouri. Now, this one seems a little surprising for it to be not considered a toss-up, for it to be considered a toss-up. I do not realistically think it's going to be a toss-up. The state of Missouri is easily a solid Republican state on the presidential level. But if you look, Mike Parson, who took over after Eric Greitens had to resign, he won his race narrowly in 2016, narrowly for the state of Missouri, in the sense that it's a Republican winning. But Eric Greitens had to resign, and his lieutenant governor at the time, Mike Parson, had to take over. Mike Parson doesn't necessarily have too much to worry about for the Republican primary, and in the general election, he is running against the Missouri state auditor, who does know, or at least won a statewide race in the state of Missouri. This is considered likely and lean by some polling organizations, and when you look at the polling data, it doesn't look too favorable for the Democrats. I wouldn't say this race is safe, though. I do think that this one will narrow down, especially after what the 2016 showed. Missouri is one of those states that isn't afraid to vote down ballot. They may not be as, they don't have as many Democrats as you might expect. I mean, Missouri used to be a Democratic state. There's still a lot of people who are registered Democrats that will 100% vote Republicans a lot of the time, so don't let the party composition of a state fool you. But I honestly think that the Missouri Democrats have a realistic shot of getting this under the 15% margin. I think that this race will inevitably just narrow up because you're talking about a candidate who's already won a statewide race, and that's not the state of Missouri. And then you're talking about someone who had to take over for a corrupt governor. All of those things may not necessarily be beneficial. There's no way the Republicans lose this race, but I'm saying that it's not going to be safe. That's an accomplishment in itself for the Democrats in Missouri, but obviously it doesn't help their party composition numbers. But we should pay attention to that one a little bit closer because it was interesting in 2016 how close a lot of these governor races were, considering the fact that Donald Trump absolutely decimated Hillary Clinton in a number of these states. As for Vermont and New Hampshire, now these are two predominantly Democratic states on the presidential level. We pretty much see them voting the same way almost all of the time. And Vermont has an incumbent Republican who was elected in 2018, if you remember. I covered his race, Governor Phil Scott, who ran against, Christine Hallquist, and he's up for re-election. So they actually served 2-year terms. So he was first elected in 2016 and then re-elected in 2018, is actually one of the more popular governors in the country. In fact, he's within the top 10. Both of them, side by side, New Hampshire and Vermont's governors right now are number 4 and 5 in terms of their approval ratings nationwide. And when you look, Phil Scott is on a pathway to win. No contested Republican primary, and he's running against the lieutenant governor of Vermont. That's the only reason why I didn't consider this race safe. Before, I would have considered it to be safe. And yes, there is a presidential election happening, but you have a very popular governor who's running against the lieutenant governor. This was bound to happen. And this year, it may not necessarily be the year that this lieutenant governor wins this election. He probably should have waited for Phil Scott to not run for re-election. With 2-year terms, it probably wasn't going to happen for a while. But when you look at the data that's out from February, okay? David Zuckerman is the incumbent lieutenant governor. People know who this is, and they're still not too sure about voting for him. 15% undecided, 4% other, and that still doesn't get over that 50% majority, that 52% majority, actually, that Phil Scott already has. So I would actually consider the state of Vermont. I think it will narrow down to being a likely state just because of down-ballot voting on Election Day, considering it's not a midterm year. and people are going to be a lot less cautious of individual races such as this one, being way more focused on the presidential race. But realistically, I don't see the Democrats picking it up. As for the state of New Hampshire, same type of predicament. This state has 2-year terms. It voted for Chris Sununu in 2018. It voted for Chris Sununu in 2016. So they were both elected around the same time, had close races, but again, we're talking about a popular governor here who is currently running against a majority leader of New Hampshire Senate. Realistically, that's the person who's going to win the primary. But again, people know who that is. Still not sure about voting for them, and not enough to overcome a 56% numbers right now. And I'm not just basing this purely off polling data. A Democratic wave year, Chris Sununu won, and New Hampshire, I'm going to consider a likely Republican state right now. So sending both of those governors back to their governor mansions for another 2-year term. So the Republicans officially have the majority, but let's talk about the remaining 2 states, North Carolina and Montana. North Carolina, this one is actually not going to be too close. Roy Cooper, actually, the reason why this came into my head is because there's new polling data from the state of North Carolina that shows Roy Cooper with a pretty substantial margin over Dan Forest. Let's see if it's on. I don't know if it's on here. I know it was on somewhere between, I think this is, let's see, governor polls. I don't know if they covered it, but yeah, they haven't. So pretty much the state of North Carolina is pretty solid for Roy Cooper. In fact, he is approved of nationwide by a pretty substantial margin, not nationwide, approved of in the state of North Carolina by a pretty substantial margin, especially as a Democrat from the state of North Carolina, 47% to 32%. Okay, he won in an election year in which Donald Trump was also on the ballot. He won in 2016 against an incumbent Republican, Dan McCready, and he won by a narrow margin, but still won. Okay, he led by 2.2% and ended up winning by 0.2%. So even if you adjust that for the Republican in these type of polls, he still wins by 6% according to the recent poll, or 2% according to a poll done last June. So North Carolina, I'm actually going to consider a likely Democrat right now. I do not think it's going to be super narrow, and Roy Cooper's a popular governor, and also I think the Democrats are going to do a little bit better, at least in the presidential election, and probably a lot better on the governor's election as well. So the final state to talk about is the state of Montana. Now, the state of Montana has a very interesting dynamic, much like some of these other Republican states. They always vote for a Democrat, typically on one of their ballots at least. Whether it's a midterm election year or a presidential election year, usually they're simultaneously electing a Republican and a Democrat. And it is very, very interesting. So when you look at who's running on the Democratic side, we have Whitney Williams, a daughter of a former U.S. congressman, who is pretty well known throughout the state, and Mike Cooney, obviously, who would be insanely known throughout the state, who is the former Secretary of State and Lieutenant Governor of Montana. So they pretty much know how to do well in statewide elections, even if their name is not directly going to be voted for separately. But on the Republican side, we have Tim Fox, Attorney General of Montana, and Greg Gianforte. Now, if his name rings a bell, it should, because he won the special election for the United States Representative seat in Montana. He was infamous in the mainstream news media because he body slammed a reporter, supposedly at least, based off reports from some of the news stations out in Montana, and that narrowed down his race in the Montana seat, but he ended up still winning, and now he's running against the Attorney General. So he's actually leading in preliminary primary polling data, and that's very interesting. I mean, we're talking about an incumbent representative who was elected after this Attorney General came into power. So it's not necessarily as simple as black and white. Greg Gianforte is probably going to end up winning this primary because his name is probably a lot I guess more recently in the heads of Montana voters, but looking at the general election, it's rated as a toss-up or a lean Republican seat. Now, I do think that this race actually will end up going towards the Democrats very narrowly. I think this one's going to be a tilt Democratic seat. My reason being is because the state of Montana, well, Steve Bullock, number one, is going to have a huge impact on this race. He ran for president, is now running for Senate. So a lot of people who are going to recognize his name on the Senate ballot are also going to be, I guess, a lot more reluctant to vote for the Montana lieutenant governor, who is pretty well known throughout the state. I mean, in 2016, he didn't have the largest margin, but he did win in the same year as Donald Trump, Steve Bullock, with Mike Cooney on the race itself. He ran against Greg Gianforte, who previously lost the governor's seat. So if he is the Republican nominee, I don't think that he's going to end up winning. Yes, this shows with a number of undecided voters, but Steve Bullock is going to have a huge impact on this race, being a popular governor. Let's see if I can go ahead and find his approval rating. So right here, 52% to 31%. Also ran for president. Will have a lot of money left over from the Senate race, or for the Senate race, and it's honestly, I think it's going to carry the Democrats to a victory in the Montana governor race. So that pretty much wraps up this video. 26 Republicans, 24 Democrats. Thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all tomorrow.